The ships came out of nowhere. One moment, the sky above the Pacific Ocean was clear and blue. The next, it was gone, replaced by metal. Hundreds of vessels, each one bigger than any city on Earth, hung in the sky like dark mountains that had forgotten how to fall. They made no sound, they moved no air, they simply appeared, and the world below them went very, very quiet. Every satellite in orbit picked up the signal at the same time. Every screen on Earth flickered, every radio channel cut to static, and then a voice came through, calm, flat, and completely certain of itself. Inhabitants of designation Terra, this is the Vreth Dominion. We are the original architects of life on this world. Your civilization has existed here on borrowed time. That time has now ended. You have 72 of your hours to begin full evacuation of this planet. Leave your structures, leave your equipment, leave everything. Non-compliance will result in sterilization of the surface. This is not a negotiation. This is a notification. And then, the signal cut off. For about 10 seconds, the entire human race was silent. Then everyone started talking at once. Admiral Sarah Voss was eating breakfast when the alert came through. She was on orbital station Kestrel, 90 kilometers above the Indian Ocean, and she had been looking forward to her coffee for the last hour. She put the cup down very slowly when she saw the fleet numbers on her screen. Then she stood up, walked to the command deck, and studied the data without saying a single word for almost 3 minutes. Her staff stood around her, waiting. They had learned over the years not to rush her. "Get me a full scan of every ship," she finally said. "Weapons configuration, shield output, engine signature. I want to know how they move and how they stop moving." "Admiral," one of her officers said carefully, "there are over 400 vessels in that formation. Some of them are bigger than—" "I know how big they are," Voss said. "That's why I want the scan." She was 53 years old. She had short gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from something patient and hard. She had served in the Resource Wars, survived the Martian uprising of 2151, and once, famously, held a crippled orbital station together with 3 working engines and the sheer force of her refusal to accept failure. She was not a person who panicked. She was not even a person who hurried. She simply looked at problems until she found the place where they were breakable. She started looking now. Down on Earth, the response was exactly what you would expect from 8 billion people who had just been told to leave their home planet within 3 days. Nobody moved. Emergency councils formed within the hour. On Earth, on Mars, on the orbital stations, in the belt colonies out past Jupiter, every human government, every military branch, every civilian authority linked up on a single shared channel. The conversation was loud and fast and sometimes angry, but it moved in one direction from the very beginning. Nobody was leaving. A councilman from New Beijing made the point clearly. "We have nowhere to go. Mars is ours. The belt is ours. The stations are ours. We built all of it. If we leave Earth, we lose everything. And if we show them that threats work—" He stopped, took a breath. Then the threats never stop. There was agreement across every channel. It wasn't brave exactly. It was something quieter than bravery. It was just a simple, flat refusal, the kind that doesn't need to shout because it has already made up its mind. On the Vreth flagship, a vessel called Eternal Dominion, which was roughly the size of a small moon, the High Commander reviewed his reports with mild interest. His name was Vorath Sen. He was ancient by human standards, though he would not have thought of it that way. He had overseen the reclamation of 11 worlds during his career. Each one had followed the same pattern. First, denial, then panic, then negotiation, then departure. The whole process usually took less than a week. He had looked at the files on humanity before arriving. They were thin files, as far as he was concerned. A young species, barely 3,000 years of recorded history that mattered. They had only left their home planet 2 centuries ago. They had a few colonies, a modest fleet, some weapons that were considered adequate for a developing civilization. He was not concerned. His aide, a female officer named Kelsov, who handled xenosociology, placed a new report on his desk. She had spent the last 12 hours studying human communication networks. "They are not preparing to evacuate," she said. "They will," Vorotsen said. "They are not even discussing it," she continued. "Their communications are almost entirely focused on defense coordination and weapons deployment. There is no panic, no mass movement of civilian populations. There is," she paused, looking at the data again, "anger. A great deal of it." Vorotsen looked up at her for the first time. Anger? Yes, he thought about this. Then he dismissed it. Young species were often angry before they accepted reality. The anger always faded. He did not yet understand that for humans, anger was not a phase. It was a gear. 68 hours before the deadline, the Vreth sent an ambassador's shuttle down to Geneva. The message it carried was simple. The Vreth were willing to allow humanity to keep a small fleet of colony ships and a negotiated selection of personal possessions, as a courtesy to a young civilization. This was, the message noted, far more generous than what most reclaimed species received. The ambassador waited in a glass room overlooking the Alps, while the human delegation gathered outside. He had done this 11 times. He waited 4 hours. When the human representatives finally came in, they sat down across from him, put their hands flat on the table, and one woman, middle-aged, gray-eyed, wearing a plain military uniform with no decorations, spoke for all of them. "We're not leaving," she said. The ambassador blinked. "I understand the emotional difficulty." "We're not leaving," she said again. "Perhaps you don't fully grasp the firepower available to." "We understand the firepower," she said. "We've been running calculations on your fleet since you arrived. We understand exactly what you have, and we're still not leaving." She looked at him evenly. "You should go back and tell them that, because after your deadline passes, this situation becomes something different. And once it becomes something different, we won't be having this kind of polite conversation again." The ambassador returned to the shuttle. He filed his report. He noted that the humans were irrational and emotional, and would likely come to their senses once the deadline passed. He was wrong about almost everything. With 1 hour remaining, Admiral Voss opened a direct channel to the Vreth fleet. She sat in her command chair, calm and still, and she spoke in a quiet voice that somehow carried the weight of an entire species behind it. "This is Admiral Sarah Voss, commanding officer of Earth's orbital defense grid. I am speaking on behalf of every human being in this solar system. You came here assuming we would be afraid of you. We are not afraid of you. You came here assuming we would run. We will not run. You have 1 hour left. I am asking you, not because we are weak, but because we are not cruel, to turn your fleet around and leave." She paused. "After that hour, we stop asking." There was a long silence from the Vreth fleet. Then a response came through, short, cold, and dismissive. "When the deadline passes, you will understand the difference between courage and foolishness." Voss looked at the transmission log for a moment. Then she turned to her weapons officer. "Start the clock," she said, "and make sure everyone in the solar system is watching." Outside the station window, Earth turned slowly below her, green and blue and white, and impossibly beautiful. 340 million square kilometers of mountains and oceans and cities and life. The home of the human race. The clock reached 0, and the Vreth fleet learned, for the first time, that they had made a mistake. The Vreth opened with what they considered a gentle strike. 12 kinetic rounds, each one the size of a building, were fired at 6 orbital stations above Earth. The calculations were precise. The targeting was perfect. In every previous reclamation, this kind of opening strike destroyed the target's ability to coordinate, shattered civilian confidence, and made any organized resistance impossible within hours. The rounds hit, and orbital station Kestrel shook hard, lost 2 outer modules, sealed its emergency bulkheads in under 4 seconds, and returned fire with every weapon it had. The other 5 stations did the same. In the Vreth Tactical Center aboard Eternal Dominion, the weapons officer stared at his screen and said nothing for almost 6 seconds. Then he said, very quietly, "The stations are still operational." The commander beside him leaned forward. "That's not possible. We hit them directly." "They absorbed the damage," the officer said. "All 6 stations. The damage is significant, but none of them have lost primary function." He looked up slowly. They built their stations with 17 layers of redundant systems. The outer hull damage is cosmetic. The cores are untouched. No one in the tactical center had an immediate response to that. Admiral Voss stood at the center of Kestrel's command deck and watched the battle data scroll across every screen around her. Dust from the impact was still settling in the corridor outside. 2 of her crew had minor injuries. She had been given a medical report and set it aside for later. "Return fire is good," her weapons officer said. "Hits confirmed on 4 Vreth vessels. They were not expecting that kind of range from us." "No," Voss agreed. "They weren't." The Vreth had done what every overconfident enemy did. They had looked at humanity's official military records, noted the listed weapon ranges and shield capacities, and made their plans accordingly. What they had not accounted for was the very human habit of quietly building things that performed better than advertised. Not because humans were secretive by nature, but because every engineer who had ever worked on a defense project had been haunted by the possibility of being wrong, and had overbuilt accordingly. The railguns on Kestrel had a listed range of 40,000 kilometers. They had an actual range of nearly 62,000. The Vreth found this out the hard way. On the ground in Australia, the Vreth launched their first land assault. They chose the continent because it was large, sparsely populated in most areas, and their scouts had assessed it as an easy foothold. 6,000 Vreth infantry troops in heavy combat armor landed in 3 waves across the western interior. They were equipped with weapons that had crushed opposition on 11 different worlds. They walked into silence. For about 8 minutes, nothing happened. The terrain was flat and red and hot. There were no visible human soldiers anywhere. Then, the ground started talking. Automated turret systems rose out of camouflaged positions across a 40-kilometer front. Drone units launched from buried bays. Beneath the Vreth forces, a web of communication cutting signals activated, separating their units from each other and from the fleet above, and from hardened underground bunkers that had been built, maintained, and upgraded over the last 60 years, because human strategic planners had always assumed that one day something would come from the sky. Militia units moved out in coordinated formations. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were farmers, engineers, teachers, and mechanics who had been training for exactly this moment since they were teenagers. Because that was what you did in a world that had learned over centuries of suffering that safety was something you built and maintained and never took for granted. They fought with the efficiency of people who were not angry in a hot, burning way, but in a cold and focused way that was much more dangerous. Within 2 hours, the first wave of Vreth ground forces had been cut to pieces. The second wave landed to find the first in full retreat. The third wave was recalled before it reached the ground. A Vreth general aboard his command ship sent a message to Vorath Sen. The humans have prepared this world for exactly this kind of engagement. Every region we scan has defensive infrastructure. This is not improvised. This has been built over generations. Vorath Sen read the message and felt for the first time something that might have been unease. He pushed it away. He had options remaining. He used the wrong one. The debate in the Vreth High Command had lasted about 40 minutes. Some voices had urged patience. The xenosociology officer, Kelsov, had argued specifically against escalation, saying the humans needed to be engaged through negotiation, that their resistance was structural and would not be broken by forced demonstrations. She was overruled. Vorath-Sen made the decision at approximately 3 in the afternoon, Earth time. A focused orbital strike. One city, large enough to matter, small enough to be surgical. The message was simple and old as warfare itself. Look at what we can do to you. Now stop fighting. The city chosen was Perth. It had a population of 340,000 people. The strike lasted less than 90 seconds. When it was over, there was nothing where Perth had been. Not ruins, not rubble, just a crater where a city full of people used to be, still glowing faintly at the edges. On every human channel, military, civilian, government, private, across Earth, Mars, the belt, the stations, and every ship in space, everything went silent. Not from shock, not from panic, from something else. It lasted exactly 60 seconds. Later, no one could fully explain why it was 60 seconds. It just was. As if the entire human race took one breath together and held it. Then Admiral Voss's voice came through. She spoke in the same quiet, level tone she always used. And that made it worse somehow. Much worse. Perth had 340,000 people, she said. She stopped there. Let the number sit. Then, we will remember that number. That was all. But in the Belt colonies, Commander Dio Okafor, who had been holding his reserve fleet in position for 2 days, watching and waiting with the patience of a man who had fought in 4 wars and knew exactly how long to wait before moving, turned to his navigation officer and gave a single instruction. All ahead full, he said. We're done waiting. 217 Belt warships began moving toward Earth at maximum burn. They had been built for mining operations and long-distance resource transport, and they were ugly, blocky vessels with no elegance to them at all. But they were heavily armored. They carried weapons that had been quietly upgraded every year for the past 3 decades, and they were crewed by people who had grown up in the hardest, most unforgiving environment in the solar system, and had never in their lives taken anything lying down. And they were angry now. Not the angry of people who had been frightened and were covering it up, the angry of people who had been patient and careful and reasonable, and had just watched a city of 340,000 human beings get erased from the face of their home planet. That kind of angry does not cool down. That kind of angry becomes fuel. Vorath-Sen was reviewing the post-strike data when Kelsov walked into his command room without being announced. She stood in front of his desk with a look on her face that made him set down his report. I told you not to do that, she said. The strike was a tactical necessity. It was a catastrophic error, she said. You did not break their will. You removed the last reason they had to hold anything back. She put a data pad on his desk. On it was a map of the solar system, with a cluster of 300 moving signals burning toward Earth from the outer belt. That fleet has been holding position for 2 days, she said. They were waiting to see what we did next. They wanted to give diplomacy a chance. She tapped the screen. They are not waiting anymore. Vorath-Sen looked at the map. Then he looked at the numbers attached to those moving signals. Then he was quiet for a long time. What do they want? He finally asked. Kelsov looked at him like the question itself was the problem. They want Perth back, she said, and you can't give it to them. Outside the viewport of eternal dominion, the stars were cold and countless, and somewhere out among them, 217 ships, full of people who had nothing left to lose, were accelerating toward him, and they showed absolutely no sign of slowing down. 1 week into the war, Vorath-Sen sat in his command room and looked at numbers that made no sense. He had come to this solar system with 431 ships. He had lost 62 of them. Another 90 were damaged badly enough to be out of active combat. His ground forces had been pushed off the planet entirely after the 3rd landing attempt ended the same way the first 2 had, in organized, efficient destruction that cost him soldiers and equipment and gave him nothing in return. Meanwhile, humanity had lost 11 orbital stations, 2 of which had been fully destroyed. They had lost ships as well, more ships than him, in raw numbers. But their numbers kept replacing. Every day, more vessels emerged from the shipyards at Mars and the Belt, crewed and armed, and moving toward his position. It was like hitting water. Every gap he made filled back in immediately. He had modeled this war as something that would last 4 days. It had been 7, and it was getting harder, not easier. He pulled up his tactical AI's original assessment of humanity. He read it slowly, line by line. Limited military experience at interstellar scale, emotionally driven decision-making, individual unit cohesion inconsistent, likely to fracture under sustained pressure. He closed the file. Then he opened Kelsov's report, the one she had filed on day 1 that he had skimmed and mostly ignored. He read it properly this time. All of it. Then he sat in his chair for a very long time and thought about what he had gotten himself into. Kelsov was in her research cabin when the door opened and Vorath Sen stepped inside. He looked like a man who had not slept well. He sat down in the only other chair without asking, and looked at her with something she had never seen in his face before. "Tell me," he said, "everything you know about them, from the beginning." She pulled up her research and started talking. She told him about the history. Not the political history, the survival history. She told him about the ice ages, the plagues, the wars that had gone on for decades and centuries with no end in sight, and how each time, somehow the species had not simply continued, but rebuilt and expanded and gone further than before. She told him about the 20th century alone, 2 world wars, a global pandemic, a Cold War that had half the planet living under the real possibility of nuclear annihilation for 40 years. And they had come through all of it. Changed, damaged, quieter in some ways and louder in others, but through it. "They have a phrase," she said, "what doesn't kill you makes you stronger." They say it casually. They put it on motivational decorations. But it is not casual. It is a cultural encoding of a survival lesson that goes back thousands of years. These are people who have faced extinction so many times that they have built resilience into their culture, the same way we build it into ship hulls. Vorath Sen was quiet. "There's more," she said. "They don't fight the way we fight. When we wage war, we have clear military and civilian separation. Soldiers fight, civilians shelter. For humans, that line barely exists in crisis. A civilian engineer in wartime will work 36 hours without sleep to fix a weapons system. A doctor will operate under artillery fire without stopping. A farmer will pick up a rifle and hold a defensive line until soldiers arrive. They don't separate who they are from the emergency they're in. They merge with it." She leaned forward. "And the most dangerous thing, the thing our models completely failed to account for, is this. They do not fight because they are told to. They fight because they want to protect each other. That is a different engine entirely. You can break an army that fights because it is ordered to fight. You cannot easily break a population that fights because the person next to them matters to them personally." In a holding bay on the lower levels of Eternal Dominion, 3 Vreth soldiers sat across a table from a human officer named Lieutenant Chen. They had been captured during the 3rd ground landing attempt. They had expected to be executed, or at minimum imprisoned in brutal conditions. This was standard treatment for captured enemies in most of the wars the Vreth Dominion had fought. Instead, they had been given food, warm food prepared carefully, with apparent attention to their dietary requirements, which the humans had researched from publicly available Vreth biological records. They had been given clean beds, their injuries had been treated, and once a day, Lieutenant Chen came down and sat with them and talked. Not for interrogation. At least it didn't feel like interrogation. He asked them questions about their families. He showed them pictures of his own family, a wife, 2 sons, a small house on Mars with a garden. He told them that his older son had started learning to play guitar, and was, in his father's fully unbiased opinion, already quite good. The eldest captured soldier, a veteran named Tev-Oran, found this deeply confusing. "Why are you doing this?" Tev-Oran asked on the fourth day. Chen thought about it. "Because you're people," he said, "and you're hurt, and my mother raised me to take care of hurt people when I can." Tev-Oran did not know what to do with that answer. He filed a report about it through a code and communication channel that the humans were, in fact, fully aware of and letting him use intentionally. When Kelsov read the report, she marked it and sent it directly to Vorat Sen with a note attached. "They are doing this deliberately. They are showing us what they are capable of at both ends of the scale. They can destroy a city. They can also feed prisoners and show them family photographs. They want us to understand that this is a choice, that they are choosing how much force to use, that they have significantly more available." Commander Dio Okafor arrived with his belt fleet on day 8 and immediately changed the character of the battle. He was 61 years old, built like a man who had spent decades doing hard physical work in low gravity, and he had a reputation that had preceded him through 3 wars. Not for brilliance exactly, but for a particular kind of strategic stubbornness that wore enemies down until they made mistakes, and then hit those mistakes so hard they never recovered. His fleet was not elegant. Belt ships never were. They were thick-hulled, slow to accelerate, and looked more like asteroids with engines than proper warships. But they were nearly impossible to kill in a straight fight. And Okafor had not come for a straight fight anyway. He had come for what he called in a briefing to his officers, the anvil. He explained it simply. The Vreth fleet needed supply lines. Those supply lines ran through the outer system. The Belt fleet was going to cut them, hold them, and squeeze. Earth's orbital forces and the Martian combined fleet were the hammer. The Belt fleet was the anvil. The Vreth caught in the middle without resupply would have to either break out or run out of power. "They have a bigger fleet," his navigation officer noted. "They had a bigger fleet," Okafor said calmly. 3 weeks from now, that number looks different." He was right. He was usually right about things like this, which was why people kept giving him ships. On day 10, a Vreth supply convoy of 12 vessels was intercepted in the outer system and destroyed before it reached the main fleet. On day 12, a second convoy was turned back. On day 14, a third convoy made it through, but lost 6 of its 9 ships in the process, and arrived with barely a third of its intended supplies. In the tactical center of Eternal Dominion, the logistics officer placed a report in front of Vorath Sen, with the careful movements of someone delivering very bad news to someone who was not going to take it well. Power reserves at 31%. Ammunition for primary weapon systems down to 44%. Medical supplies critically low after the failed ground campaigns. Estimated combat effectiveness in 3 weeks, 40% of current capacity. Vorat Sen read it twice. He set it down. He called Kelsov. "If we requested a ceasefire negotiation," he asked, "do you believe they would agree to it?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think they would agree to hear us out," she said. "Whether they would actually stop fighting," she paused. "That depends on what we offer them, and on whether they believe we would honor it." "And do you think they would believe us?" he asked. Another pause, longer this time. "I think," she said carefully, "that we destroyed a city of 340,000 people. And I think that every human in this solar system knows that number. Every single one. They're carrying that number with them right now." She stopped. "Belief takes time to earn. We have given them no reason to start." Vorath Sen looked out his viewport at the stars. "Draft the ceasefire request," he said. "Send it through the standard diplomatic channels." He did not feel relieved making that decision. He felt what he suspected was the appropriate emotion for a commander who had led his people into a war they had no business fighting and had not yet fully reckoned with the cost of it. He felt ashamed. The ceasefire request reached Admiral Voss at 0600 hours, station time. She read it carefully. Then she set it aside on the corner of her desk, under a datapad with the casualty reports from the last week, and turned back to her battle screens. Her communications officer looked at her cautiously. "Admiral, the ceasefire request." "I saw it," Voss said. "Are we going to respond?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell them we received it. Tell them we'll talk when we're ready." She turned back to her screens. "What's Okafor's resupply status?" "Belt fleet is fully resupplied, Admiral. Ready to move." "Good," she said, and nothing else. Outside the station, the stars were full of human ships, and none of them were going anywhere. By the third week, the Vreth fleet had pulled back to Jupiter's moons. It was not a retreat, Vorath Sen told himself. It was a strategic repositioning, a consolidation of forces, a preparation for future negotiations from a position of strength. He almost believed it. The truth was simpler and harder. His fleet was bleeding. Every day of holding still cost him power. Every skirmish at the outer edge of his defensive perimeter cost him ships he could not replace. The supply convoys from the Dominion were being intercepted with increasing regularity by the Belt Fleet, which moved through the asteroid field with an ease that should have been impossible for ships that size, but apparently was not when your crews had grown up flying through rock fields for a living. He had sent 4 messages to the Dominion capital requesting reinforcements. The first 2 had received polite acknowledgement. The third had received a response saying that reinforcements were being assembled. The fourth had received nothing. He understood what that silence meant. The Dominion was watching to see how this ended before committing more ships to a campaign that had not gone according to plan. He was on his own. The meeting that changed everything happened not in any war room or command center, but on a small transport vessel drifting in neutral space between the 2 fleets. Admiral Voss and Commander Okafor sat on one side of a plain table. Vorath Sen sat on the other, with Kelsov beside him. There were no weapons in the room. There were 2 cups of water on the human side of the table, and a small environmental unit on the Vreth side that kept the air at a composition the Vreth could breathe. Vorath Sen had prepared a speech. He had written it carefully over 3 days. It acknowledged errors in judgment, expressed regret for civilian casualties, and outlined a proposed framework for mutual disengagement. He got 3 sentences in before Voss held up one hand. "I know why you're here," she said, "and I understand what you're asking for, but I want you to understand something first." She put her hands flat on the table. "There is a crater on the western coast of Australia, where 340,000 people used to live. It rains there now. The rain hits the crater floor. There is nothing there to shelter under, because we haven't rebuilt it yet. Because the people who would have helped rebuild it are gone." She let that sit for a moment. "Whatever you say in this room today, that doesn't change. That crater is still there when we're done talking. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Vorath Sen was quiet. Then he said, "Yes." "Good," Voss said. "Then we can talk." The ceasefire was not agreed to in that meeting. It was the first of 6. They met every 2 days. Each time Vorath Sen came with proposals. Each time, Voss listened to them, asked clear and specific questions, and sent him back with something to think about. She was not cruel about it. She was not theatrical. She was simply thorough, and she took her time, and Vorath Sen slowly began to understand that the thoroughness was not delay. It was the message itself. She was showing him what patience looked like when it had nothing to prove. Meanwhile, the war did not stop. Okafor kept Belt Fleet on the supply lines. Not aggressively. He wasn't cutting off the Vreth entirely, which would have forced a desperate push. He kept them at about 40% supply efficiency. Enough to survive, not enough to fight at full capacity. He had described his strategy to Voss as a slow squeeze on a fruit you want juice from, not pulp. Voss had found that visual accurate, if unpleasant. It was during the 4th week that Kel Avrin made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He was a young Vreth pilot, 24 years old by Vreth reckoning, which was somewhat younger than it sounded. He had been flying scout missions along the edge of the human defense line, running sensor sweeps, and reporting back on fleet movements. It was careful, quiet work that suited him. He had never been comfortable with direct combat, a fact he had kept to himself since it was not the kind of thing you admitted in the Vreth military. Over 3 weeks of patrol missions, he had been listening to human communication channels. Not military channels, those were encrypted, but civilian ones, which humans appeared to operate with almost no security at all, as though the idea of restricting personal communication during wartime was not something that had occurred to them. He heard people talking to their families, parents checking that their children were safe, 2 people on a Mars station having what sounded like an argument about which of them had forgotten to feed the cat, a man recording a long birthday message for his daughter, telling her that he was sorry he couldn't be there, that she should eat the cake even though he wasn't there to share it, that he loved her so much it was uncomfortable to say out loud, but he was saying it anyway because that was important. Kelavran listened to these things for 3 weeks. He filed his sensor reports. He ate his meals. He slept when he could. On the 23rd day, he set his scout ship on a heading toward the human defense line, activated his beacon as a non-hostile signal, and opened a channel. "This is Vreth scout pilot Kelavran," he said. "I am requesting asylum. I am not armed. I am not a threat. He stopped. Tried again. "I would like to stop being on the wrong side of this." There was a long silence from the human side. Then a voice said, calmly and without hostility, "We see you. Come ahead slowly. Someone will meet you." He was met, received, given food, and assigned a small cabin on one of the orbital stations. No one treated him badly. A few people treated him with guarded curiosity. One woman, an engineer from the station's maintenance crew, came by his cabin the second day and asked if he wanted to play cards. She taught him. He later said it was the most surprising thing that happened to him in the entire war. Operation Long Memory launched at 0300 hours on day 29. Voss had chosen the name herself. Her staff had thought it was a strategic code name. It was not. It was a statement of intent. The operation was a 3-axis simultaneous strike on the Vreth defensive position around Jupiter's moons. Earth's orbital fleet came from the inner system. The Martian combined fleet came from above the orbital plane. Okafor's belt fleet came from the outer system. All 3 forces hit within 4 minutes of each other, which was a coordination achievement that the Vreth tactical AI had rated as essentially impossible given the communication delays involved. It was not impossible. It just required 3 commanders who trusted each other completely, and had been planning it for 10 days. The Vreth defensive line did not crack. It shattered. The outer screen went in the first 20 minutes. The inner formation broke apart within 2 hours as ships tried to fall back, and found the retreat routes already covered. Vorath Sen's flagship was surrounded by Hour 3, with every escape vector blocked, and its power reserves at 18%. At that point, Voss opened a channel. "Vorath Sen," she said, "this is over. You can end it now or we can end it for you. I'd prefer the first option. So would you." There was a pause that lasted almost a minute. Then Vorath Sen's voice came through, flat and very quiet. "I accept your terms." The terms were fair. This was the thing that confused Vorath Sen most deeply, even more than the military defeat. They were completely, almost aggressively fair. No Vreth ships would be taken. No prisoners would be held beyond a brief processing period. No reparations were demanded beyond a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and a legal renunciation of all territorial claims to the Sol system. The agreement had been written clearly, in plain language, so there was no way to misread it. His aide, Kelsov, read the terms 3 times, looking for the trap. There wasn't one. As the Vreth fleet was escorted to the edge of the solar system by a human formation, not surrounding them aggressively, just flanking them, making the direction of travel clear. Vorath Sen stood at his viewport and watched the sun grow smaller behind them. He thought about 11 reclamations. He thought about how simple they had always been, how the pattern had never changed. He thought about what it meant that this one had been different in every possible way from the beginning, and how he had not seen it coming, and whether he should have. The human officer escorting the fleet was a young commander named Reyes. He had been professional and polite throughout the entire escort, answering questions, providing navigational data, making sure the route was clear. As the fleet reached the point where the escort would end, Vorath Sen opened a personal channel to Reyes's ship. "I have a question," he said. "Of course," Reyes said. "Why did you let us leave? Your fleet had us completely surrounded. You could have destroyed us entirely." He paused. "You had the power. You had the reason. Why did you not use it?" Reyes was quiet for a moment. Not a hesitant quiet, a thinking quiet. "Because then you couldn't go home," he said, "and tell everyone what happened here." Vorath Sen stayed at the viewport long after the channel closed. Behind him, growing smaller every second, the blue and green light of Earth was just barely visible through the stars. He looked at it until it disappeared. He thought he finally understood. He was going to have to think about a great many things on the way home. Vorath Sen had been practicing his report for most of the journey home. He had written it out 7 times. Each version was different. The first few tried to explain the loss in ways that made it sound manageable. A miscalculation, an underestimated variable, a strategic situation that had become complicated due to unforeseen circumstances. By the 5th draft, he had stopped doing that. By the 7th draft, the report was simply the truth, written as plainly as he could write it, from start to finish. He stood before the Dominion High Council in the Capitol Chamber, and delivered it without notes. He told them everything. The opening strike that hadn't worked, the ground landings that had been dismantled with machinery that had been waiting underground for 60 years. The supply lines that had been cut with a patience and precision he still found astonishing. The 6 rounds of ceasefire negotiations with a human admiral who had never once raised her voice and never once needed to. The final battle that had lasted less than 4 hours. And Perth. He did not skip over Perth. He stopped on it, in fact, and stayed there longer than the purely military account required, because he had come to believe, slowly on the long journey home, that Perth was the hinge of the whole story. That the moment that city was destroyed was the moment the war stopped being winnable. Not because it was the worst thing the Dominion had done in its long history, but because it was done to a species that remembered things, and that had just enough patience to make the remembering count. When he finished, the chamber was very quiet. The council elder, a woman named Avith Saul, who had held her position for longer than Vorath Sen had been alive, looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "You are telling us that humanity cannot be reclaimed." "I am telling you," Vorath Sen said, "that we should never have tried, and I am telling you that they will not forget we did." The report leaked within 2 weeks. No one ever found out who sent it, or to whom it was first sent, outside the Dominion. But, once it was out, it moved through the communications networks of the known galaxy with the speed and persistence of all information that is both true and terrible. It was translated into 37 languages by independent parties. It was quoted, debated, analyzed, and attached to a dozen different academic and military papers within the first 6 months. Everyone who read it came away with the same impression. Not that humanity was the strongest, not that they were the most technologically advanced, not that their weapons were the best or their ships the fastest. The impression was something quieter and harder to argue with. That humanity was the most expensive enemy in the known galaxy to acquire. That the cost of a fight with them was never just the fight itself. It was everything that came after. The rebuilding they would do, the lessons they would draw, the very specific and long-lasting kind of memory they would carry. Species that had been considering their own territorial ambitions in the direction of Sol quietly reconsidered. Kelsov published her research independently, 6 months after returning home. It was a long document, scholarly in its format, but not in its language. She had written it to be understood, not to impress. The core argument was something she had been trying to explain to Voraf Sen since before the war began, and had never quite managed to get through in time. She wrote that humanity was not by nature an aggressive species. She wrote that they were among the more reluctant warriors she had studied, a species that genuinely preferred trade, conversation, and the building of things to the breaking of them. She wrote about their art, their music, the enormous variety of stories they told each other about peace and love, and the ordinary goodness of small daily life. But she also wrote about what happened when that was threatened, when someone pushed through the patience and the preference for peace and reached the thing underneath. She described it as a switch, not a gradual escalation, but a shift, a moment when the calculation changed and the softness was put away entirely, and what remained was something that had survived ice ages and plagues and centuries of war against itself. Something that had learned, through every possible kind of suffering, that the way through hard things was not around them. She wrote, "They have a word for it, resolve. It sounds soft in their language. It is not soft. It is the hardest thing I have ever studied." The paper became one of the most widely read xenosociological documents in the Dominion's academic history. Several other civilizations requested translated copies. At least 3 military academies in allied species incorporated it into their strategic curriculum. The lesson was always the same: do not be the thing that flips the switch. On Mars, in a small apartment in the northern residential district of Olympus City, Kel Avran sat at a desk by a window that looked out over the red plain and wrote. He had been writing for 3 months. The memoir had started as notes he made for himself, trying to work out what he had learned and how he felt about it. Then it had grown. He was not a writer by training. He was a pilot, but he had found that the words came easily once he stopped trying to make them sound like anything other than what they were. He wrote about his patrol missions. He wrote about the voices he had heard on the civilian channels, the birthday message, the argument about the cat, the dozens of small ordinary human moments that had leaked out through the wartime airwaves and reached him in his cockpit. He wrote about his decision to cross the line, which he still wasn't entirely sure how to explain, except that it had felt less like a choice and more like a recognition, a moment of understanding what side of something he actually wanted to be on. He wrote about the woman who had taught him cards, about Lieutenant Chen, who had shown family photographs to prisoners and meant it genuinely, about the engineer at Kestrel Station who had helped him fix a translation error in his communication unit, and then stayed to have tea, because apparently that was just what you did. The opening line of the memoir was the last thing he wrote. He sat with a blank page for 2 days before it came to him. "I came here expecting to find warriors. Instead, I found gardeners, engineers, parents, and poets, who also happened to be the most dangerous thing in the known galaxy when you gave them a reason." It was published the following year. It sold well, which surprised him. He did not think of himself as someone people would be interested in. But many people, it turned out, were interested in the story of the young Vreth pilot who had listened to human voices in the dark and decided to come toward the light. He lived on Mars for the rest of his life. He worked as a cultural liaison. He never went back to the Dominion, not because he hated it, but because he had found something on Mars that he hadn't known he was looking for, and wasn't willing to trade it for familiar ground. He planted a garden outside his apartment. Nothing fancy, some low-gravity tomatoes, a few herbs, some small flowers that bloomed orange in the thin Martian sunlight. The woman who had taught him cards helped him set it up. She told him growing things was good for the mind. He came to believe she was right about that. Admiral Voss retired on a Tuesday in the middle of autumn. She gave no speeches. She did not attend any of the ceremonies that were arranged in her honor, except one, a small private gathering of her crew from Kestrel Station, which had been rebuilt by then and was back to full operation. They had dinner together in the station's main mess hall, which was not a glamorous venue, but was where they had eaten together for years, and she thought that was the right place for it. She moved to a house on the coast of Western Australia, near the site of the memorial that had been built at the edge of the Perth crater. The city itself was being rebuilt. It would take another decade. But the memorial was finished, and on the first anniversary of the strike, she went there in the early morning, before anyone else arrived, and stood at the edge of the platform that looked out over the crater. It fell into the crater, and hit the new grass that had started to grow there. Small, stubborn, green things, pushing up through the soil that had been laid down after the first cleanup crews finished their work. She stood there for a long time. She did not make any public statements. She did not need to. There was nobody there to hear one, and the people she was standing there for were not people who could hear anything anymore. She stood there until the rain stopped and the sun came through. Then she walked back to their car and drove home. She made coffee. She sat by her window and watched the ocean. The waves came in and went out with the same unhurried patience they had always had, and they would have it long after she was gone too. It was enough, she thought. It had been enough. Somewhere in the outer edge of the galaxy, a young species picked up a signal. They were new to long-range communication, had mastered it only in the last century or so, which in galactic terms was an eye blink. They had been sending their own signals out for 50 years, mostly music and data transmissions, and the kind of hopeful, carefully composed messages that young civilizations send when they believe someone out there might be listening and want to make a good impression. Someone had been listening. The signal that came back contained one document, translated into their language by a source that had taken the time to do it carefully and correctly. Attached to the document was a short note from an unnamed sender. Before you go further out into the dark, read this first, especially the part about the blue world, third from its star. They call it Earth. They are not the biggest civilization out here. They are not the oldest. They are not the most powerful, by most measurements. But they remember everything. Every promise made, and every promise broken. They are, in our experience, the best neighbors you could hope for. And the worst enemy you could ever make. They will offer you their hand first. Take it. Don't make them offer you the other one. The young species read the document. They read it again. They stayed up late, in groups, talking about it. They argued about what it meant, and what humanity was really like, and whether the document was exaggerated. Then they composed a careful, respectful message, addressed to the third planet from the star the document mentioned. The message said, "Hello, we found your story.